right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Sheri Hood, the Pressing Plant Wine. It's July 18, 2019. We're in Sheri's home. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sheri. We really appreciate this. We're going to start by asking, why wine?
Why wine? That's such a big question. So for me, most of my exposure to wine was in going to rock clubs and stuff, and wine was really not very good. It was much safer to stick with bottled beer. And so at some point, my ex-in-laws started to take us to meet us at wine areas, and so we went and met them in Napa and Sonoma, and I was living in New York at the time, and we went out to Long Island to visit wineries, and they had a really nice wine cellar, mostly New World wines, but nice aged wines. So there was really this great opportunity to get to taste wine in different stages from different places, and it was so good, and then visiting wineries, what was so cool was to hear the stories and to realize that wine involved this basic farming aspect. And I actually grew up for half of my life in Alabama, and my dad had a farm. It was a hobby farm, but it was a large hobby farm. And so I knew that farming was really tough. And so there's this really basic thing of farming. And then there's also the chemistry and microbiology side of it. And then there's this craft, and then there's a culture around it as well. And so it was so multifaceted, it was so interesting. And just that idea that it was not one thing made me more and more curious about it. And I became the person that when there was a large group of people out at a dinner, I worked in the wine industry. I used to manage bands and run record labels, American office. And so when there'd be a point where we would be going out, people would hand me the wine list, and if it was someone else's expense account, it might be a little, sometimes people gave me boundaries, on it, that's fair enough. But that's how I tasted an Opus One wine, and that's how I was able to taste some things and have an idea of what value sometimes look like, whether or not I agreed with that value, what value I put on it, and what I liked, and watch my tastes evolve over time of more big, hearty red wines, over time, to being curious about things that didn't fit in that and were not just yum wines, but were interesting and different, and and then eventually, I just find weird wines super interesting, something they have a longer conversation and are more polemic in terms of what people think of them and everything. So that's kind of how I got interested in wine. And then I was living in New York, and I'd been working in the music industry for a long time, and my partner at the time had lived in Portland and was living in New York with me, and it just became time to kind of find a new place besides New York. And I had quit the music industry maybe a year before, just kind of stopped loving music. I still loved it, but it was very difficult for me to listen to without thinking about it in a business sense, and that kind of ruined it for me. And so I needed a break from it so I could get that thing that I love more than anything back, And so in looking at places, we decided to come to Portland, and I'd actually been, so for that last year when I wasn't, after I quit management, I was working at People magazine in just kind of a filler job. I was the assistant to the New York chief, and just enjoyed just kind of going in and doing my job, coming home without a lot of homework, a never-ending type of thing. And they were one of those places that always gave me the wine list. And there was a writer there who, at my going away party, they gave me a gift certificate to Tina's because I was coming out here and they knew how much I loved wine, and they said, this woman said, I just picture you going out there and like learning how to make wine, becoming a winemaker. And here I was, like I'd been in New York for all my adult life, and I was just like, that's crazy. Like, you're funny, like, what a nice idea, And I came out here and I kind of did the same thing where I temped for like a year just to like not drain my savings and like take all the pressure off of like, what am I going to do next? And after after some time, I went on the internet and kind of like looked for wine schools, and UC Davis came up. And so I decided that I would apply. It was a science degree, and my whole family is in, I grew up with physician parents and other relatives as a pharmacist and nurses, and I did not want to go into medicine. Didn't interest me at all, and because that was what all of our life was, and it was so busy and workaholic and everything. And here then, finding something that was actually a science degree when I love science, was great. So I applied. I started to do my prereqs at PSU. So that I could spend kind of more of a minimum time in California, because I just kind of moved to Oregon, in '99, and I liked being here. So I did that for a couple of years, got my chemistry, physics, all of that, a lot of the pre-class courses for science, and then got accepted to Davis, and they strongly encouraged that you work in a winery before you start taking classes about winemaking. I was like, oh. Okay, how do I do that? And that does seem like a good idea, but that's scary. And so I know this is like more than why wine, but so I had a neighbor where I was living in Southeast, and her cousin's husband worked in vineyards, she said. So she invited us all over for dinner together, and I met Mark Gould from Ken Wright, and he was so nice. And he talked to me, for a while about things, and I asked him about, I just said, I'd really love to talk to some women in this industry, find out what this is like, and maybe if there's some areas I should really focus on to be like stronger in those areas. So he referred me to his friend Cheryl Francis, and also to Lynn Penner Ash. And so I called Cheryl, and within days, she just said like, why don't you come out here and we'll have a talk, So I went out and we sat in one of the trailers at Chehalem, and and talked about this stuff. And I told her that I needed to do a harvest, and she said, I already have my harvest crew set, but my friend Jimmy over at Wilkenzie, I heard he had a spot, so let me give him a call. So she calls Jimmy and she says, I have this lovely woman here, and she needs to do a harvest, and can I send her your way? And he's like, yeah, have her come now. So I went over to Wilkenzie and I talked to him, and told him like I didn't know anything, but I really wanted to learn. And then we started talking about music in Portland and stuff, and totally bonded on bands and things. And and I did harvest at Wilkenzie. He was assistant winemaker at the time there, Laurent. He worked for Laurent and Bernie and Ronnie, and he was doing Brooks at the time, so I got to work on the Brooks wines as well. And it kind of just this curiosity and interest and passion for learning about wine kind of led to, and that seed that crazy seed that someone put in my head that I really didn't think I thought about a whole lot more. But then when I got bored enough like typing for a living, I I was like, whoa, there's an idea. That would be a lot more interesting.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before we go on with that,
Sure.
I want to back up just for a second, just because you have such an interesting pre-wine background.
Sure.
So let me talk about music industry in New York, how you got into it, and just sort of some of the kind of highlights along the way, what you're doing there.
I loved like music from a really early age. My mom took me to see the Monkees when I went for my 5th birthday. Apparently, I fell asleep during it, but which did not mean that I didn't love it. She said, but and music was just always a passion. Seeing bands, and so when I went to school at Rutgers, they had a college radio station that was great. And I listened to it and heard that they needed volunteers. And I went in and I re-alphabetized their entire music library because I'm like that. And which I know from our discussion about how the order my wine records are in, or not quite, but I was more like that then. And I loved it. I got to see all the records, touch them, and I ended up being the music director of that station and DJing. And my job was part of my job was to get records from other labels, and then to talk to them, because once they sent it to you, they wanted to have conversations with you about them and find out if you were playing them or not, or why not, or how you could help. And I got offered a job while I was in college at the station to work in New York to promote records to college radio stations. So my whole day, so I left school actually. Rutgers is only about 45 minutes outside of New York, so I moved to New York and worked for this company called Thirsty Ear, and got to call other radio stations all day and talk to them about music, and made some amazing friends who are still my friends now, and it was like the best job ever. And so the business of music didn't seem like a gross place. It seemed like a place where you get to share the enthusiasm and excitement for all of it, and then when I left there, we represented or promoted a number of different labels, a bunch of different independent labels that kind of needed that help but didn't have a full-time person to do that. And so 2 of the labels were Beggar's Banquet and 4AD Records, and Beggar's Banquet and 4AD are tied. There's one owner that partly owned 4AD at the time, and now owns, I think, all of it. But so I mentioned to Ivo from 4AD that I was going to be leaving this company, and he said, well, if you're leaving, then we're leaving. Maybe we should talk about this, And so at 23, I was hired to open the American office of 4AD Records in New York. And I was just like, are you sure? Are you sure? This is a person who doesn't balance their checkbook and is all of a sudden, having a business account there and a lot of money put into it in order to promote records. And I was the only employee for a while. And then, so I did all aspects, publicity and retail and video and helping with licensing and touring and all of those things, and it was just like I was in heaven. It was such a dream. I actually offered at the beginning to lower my salary to make sure that this office worked, and they were like, you are not good at this part. You're not going to negotiate any licensing deals. I just couldn't believe it, And so I did that for a while. I got to work the first Pixies records, the beginning of the American bands on 4AD, Throwing Muses, their first records. But I also got to work with Dead Can Dance and Cocteau Twins, and it was amazing. And also working for someone, I've always really my first mentor. The way that the company worked was it was just so artist driven, it was really designed around letting artists, musicians express themselves. It wasn't like hit oriented, and it was trying to work into the whole business, but because it had to, but at the same time it was like really focused on that, and that left such an impression on me of like small, independent, maintaining one's like sense of integrity, being true to oneself, letting others be true to themselves. So that was really, really great. And then after that I left there to start managing one of the 4AD bands, Ultra Vivid Scene, and I had actually been managing a band called Velvet Crush at the beginning and got them signed to Creation Records, and so I started managing bands, and Ivo, even though I had left 4AD, was such a champion and sent bands my way. He called and said, there's this band Stereo Lab, and like, I think you should work with them. And I listened to them and was like, oh wow, and so it was just kind of, and I ended up managing them, from almost the start, from the very early days, from before the first like actual studio album. And a band called Cranes, who were very 4AD-like in terms of their audience. Like I knew exactly, who their audience would be, how to work with them. Later, Geffen approached me with a friend, Ray Farrell, who used to be at SST. In my college radio days, I used to talk to about like all the SST bands that were so amazing, and so he worked at Geffen, and Kurt Cobain had talked about like some of his favorite bands ever that had influenced him, and two of those bands were the Raincoats in the UK and Pall Mall from the Northwest. And so I ended up working with both of them, kind of on their resurgence, on their comeback. So that's kind of where I came from, and then I got kind of burned out on working so closely with bands, and as I said about that music part, but like also just it's a tough business. Being an artist is tough, and it's hard for artists, I think, to ever have reached a pinnacle of enough, and then it's very hard to be working for them, to be trying to reach that. And so I took a break. That's when I stopped working specifically with music. And by the time I came out here, I found like enough distance and like that love for it again.
Sure. So you got here, you meet Cheryl and Lynn and Jimmy Brooks. Tell me about sort of your first harvest experience, your first time getting your hands dirty with wine, and what it was about it that made you want to keep doing it.
It did not make me want to keep doing it.
Or the opposite of that.
I will tell you. No, it was so different from what I thought that it would be like. My as someone who did not know what any of that equipment looked like, or even really the process of it. Aside from going through tours and you get this really quick walkthrough and like but to see it happening, and that was 2000, and it was a year of like so many pincher bugs, and it was like, I remember one of the things that I learned during Harvest there is that if you put rubber bands around your pants, that they can't crawl up your pants as easily. And so I remember this being like this, like, this kind of like, year of the locust, like, oh my God, they're everywhere, and they would be everywhere. We'd be having lunch and someone would be like, oh, like, so anyway, pull one off of your head, and, so it was really amazing though to get to work with Jimmy in particular, because he really took the time as being someone who'd started his own thing of like, here's why I do things, and could certainly speak to why Willie Kenzie, what that their philosophy was, but like the really hands-on part that I got to stay after and work on. But mostly in my harvest, I was also going to school at the same time and driving back and forth, and it was long hours, and I cleaned a lot. I cleaned a lot of tanks, I had this thing where I was tired a lot, having never done this, not being like physically up to it, and then also with school, and I remember I kept like picking up the hose and I just couldn't get the order right of it, and I would often spray myself in the face and just feel like such an idiot, you know, like I'm never gonna get this, you know. And then with the cleaning, I was also wet all the time. Like my clothes were always wet, I was always cold. It was I feel like even to this day, like most scars I have on my body are from like some, you know, piece of stainless steel that I like ran into or dropped or something. And but it was this really great reality check, you know. And I also got to see like what it was like to work at a winery in Oregon, which was that we always stopped and all had lunch together, you know, and like we stopped. And my next harvest, when I was going to Davis, and I worked at Pine Ridge to get some experience there, and that was a very different experience. You know, much bigger, corporate owned. Did not stop for lunch. You know, did not really have much winemaker contact or contact with the winemaker. So this experience was really great and important for me to understand what it might look like coming back here, being in Oregon. You know, yeah.
So what was your next? So once you got through Davis and kind of decided this is what you wanted to do, or when did you decide this is what you wanted to do, and kind of what were the next steps after that?
Well, I want to actually say that I forgot about, like this one piece of advice that I got actually from different people at Willacranzi was that as I knew I was going to be going to Davis, Jimmy really gave me this advice that he felt strongly about, which is that I didn't need to go to school for it, and that his experience was to get experience and to work at wineries a lot. And I had already applied, and I had never finished school the first time, and it, you know, broke my mother's heart. And so I was really happy to have found something to go back to school for, and I wanted to learn this other side of it. And both Laurent and Bernie were like, go to school, learn this stuff, like do it, you'll come back. And the reality was that when I got to Davis, the reality was that it was really that advice was somewhere in between, you know, that I should have gotten more experience before I went to Davis so that I would have these questions to say, like, what happens when a wine looks like this? I wasn't there. So I learned all of this there through books and through professors, and through one harvest. And but at the same time, like, I was so glad I went there. Like, my professors were amazing. It was so interesting, and it really helped me to understand, you know, what to look for to keep wine from going bad. You know, and some style issues, and what some general kind of like busted some myths. You know, you always do this, you never do that. You know. You do what you think is the right thing for the wine. And I know there's some criticism that often comes up of Davis students or, you know, people coming out of there that you're going to make this like really clean, boring wine. But that's not what the emphasis was. It was just giving all of us the tools to be able to work in a winery and not let a very expensive product go to waste.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
So I came out of Davis. I had gotten a scholarship there that would pay part of my trip to going to do a New Zealand harvest internship. And so I graduated in 2003, and you know, we have opposite harvests, opposite seasons to New Zealand. So I couldn't go there until 2004. So I came back, and I had been kept in touch with Sam and Cheryl. This was so 2003 was the first year that they both quit their regular jobs as winemakers. So Cheryl was at Chehalem and Sam was at Archery Summit. And so this 2003 was the first vintage that they did in their own place. And that so I got to work for them in this beginning of a winery situation, and I learned so much, you know, and I continued to work for them off and on for a couple of years as I did more harvests. So I would say that one of the most important things that I learned from them, they then became my mentors in wine. And when I came out of school, I was so worried that I wouldn't know what the right thing to do was, like the right answer. What's the right thing you do right now? And what I learned from working with Sam and Cheryl was that there isn't a right answer. Like they, here they are, a couple, and they have very different ideas of what they like about wine, where they think wine should go, what they think it should, what needs to happen. And so that really opened my mind to this idea that, not that there isn't a wrong answer, because it can be, but that there are a lot of different ideas, and it was way more open than I thought, and and they really encouraged me. We also shut down for lunch and we shut down for dinner. There were two of us interning, a guy from Australia named Rory, and so we shut down when we had meals, and we worked really long days, and I stayed at their house a lot instead of driving back to Portland, and they let us make our own wine. Like they let us take a couple of lots, and we had the same lot, and Rory and I got to do that, work with it the way we wanted to, and those were just amazing opportunities, and so yeah, it really opened up my mind, and yeah, I was encouraged. What do you think of this? And also we played the game of options, where there's a wine that's all wrapped up, you taste it blind, and they give you three options, where is this wine from? Is it from this country, this country, this country? Or, or lots of different questions, winemaking questions, but they get a little bit more complicated or more specific. And everybody weighs in. Only one person knows the answers. And that was so interesting to be able to think about it. Why do I think that? Why do other people think that? It was this education that I didn't get at Davis. Real world, and also of wine as this kind of living, breathing thing, that's evolved because of someone's involvement and touching it, and so yeah, it was just really great. It definitely made me so excited to continue doing that, and that's when I thought wow, I'm a winemaker, before that I had always kind of thought, well, how do you know if you're a winemaker or not? What if I go to Davis and I'm not good at this? What if I learn all this stuff, but I'm just nope, this just doesn't work? Then I always thought well, there's marketing, there's sales, there's things that I've done in music that I could do here, but luckily that didn't turn out to be the case, and I still could do those things, and I'm doing those things now with my own brand, so it all comes around, yeah. So, and then after working with them, so that was 2003 for Harvest, and then again, just kind of a continual, whenever I was home, I would go in and do what they needed. They didn't have a full-time employee, so I would just go in and rack or top or whatever they needed, and I had keys to the winery. It was another one of those I'm 23 and I'm running a record label, and oh wow, I have just get out of school and I can go into a winery, crazy, people are crazy, and it's great. And so after that, I used my scholarship to go to New Zealand. I worked in Marlborough, and then I came back right away then in 2004, and I worked at Archery Summit for Anna Matzinger, and did also some pre-harvest work for her and some post-harvest work, and then decided to go back, and I really wanted to work in Central Otago, and so I got a harvest at Chard Farm, which it's an incredibly beautiful place to work, and it's part of Lord of the Rings, where it wasn't, in New Zealand, but it's just it's, the drive to work every day was scary, but was also I can't believe I work in this amazing place. Look at the road, I always came back to Oregon to do harvest. Oh, so that year also 2005, I worked at Chard Farm, but I decided I'd gone through a breakup and I was like, I need to get out of Portland. So I applied to a place in Australia for an early harvest. So I did an early harvest in the Hunter. It's very hot there and not like Oregon at all, not like Willamette Valley. And then went to Chard Farm and then came back in '05 and worked at Bethel Heights in the year that Ben and Terry like worked together as winemakers for Ben to be taking over. And so I got to work with both of them. And I'd already been friends with Ben and worked with him a little bit at Rex Hill. So it was really great. And the reason why I had done so many harvests was, as a woman in wine, like I had never, I never really learned like how to fix things, you know, how to do certain mechanical things. I also was like, I felt like I really needed to be up to speed, to get up to speed on being able to do things in the cellar very quickly. I am cautious and can be slow. Like I could be then, and I think I've come back around to that now that I don't want to, you know, break anything. But I knew that in order to work at a winery and to be like accepted as an equal by still very male dominant industry, that I needed to be able to work as fast and hard as anybody else. So I did that, and I, you know, got up to speed, got my chops, you know, and I also, it was more and more reinforced, that idea of how many ways there were to do things. So I got to see so much different equipment and learn how to use it and why people used it. And then go to another winery and say, oh, use this there, why don't you use that? And find out why somebody else didn't want to use that equipment or do things that way. And it was a really great education, you know. At the same time, I had done harvest like so many times in a row that I had really missed spring anywhere, you know. My clock was really off. Fall and winter, you know. And so after working at Bethel Heights in '05, I applied for a position at Northwest Wine Company, and so I became the assistant winemaker working for Laurent Montoliu at Northwest Wine Company. And I had to move to McMinnville, and I lived in a little carriage house that Sam and Cheryl had in the back of their house, and you know, and learn more and more of how small the community is and how supportive the community is, and you know, yeah. A lot of dinners with other winemakers that I was like, whoa, I love your wine. I can't believe I don't know what to say, you know, and to just be a part of. Yeah. Sure. And listen a lot.
Tell me a little bit about the experience in Australia and New Zealand. How it different. You talk about how different it was in Oregon. Tell me about the kind of similarities, differences, and sort of what you picked up from that part of the world that you kind of carried with you.
Sure. I think, so New Zealand is a lot like the Oregon industry. I would say that it's much more common for most winemakers to have a degree in viticulture and enology in New Zealand, whereas in Oregon it was still, you know, there were pioneers, you know, and families that they learned in that way, which didn't mean that they didn't also go to school for it, but that wasn't where the emphasis was, whereas New Zealand felt much more New World winemaking to me, but also, and so in that way was not afraid to use more mechanical methods, less small fermenters. There were certainly some small fermenters, but the 1.5 ton fermenters that we have are like, gosh, I remember going to Argyle and they had the really small totes, you know, and like that, they would never do that there. You know, that just doesn't make sense. Australia was really different. In both Australia and New Zealand, you know, they don't have a separate migrant community who comes in and picks grapes. And so I helped pick grapes in Australia, and that was amazing. You know, here no one wants me to pick grapes because I am going to be too slow, you know, and probably cut off a finger. So I could be slow ish, and that wasn't really why they brought me over there. So I got to have some experiences like that, which were really good. And yeah, but the Hunter Valley was also really community. I lived with someone, I rented a room from someone who worked in sales and marketing at Tower where I was working, and so we had met a lot of other wineries, and got to interact with other interns and things like that. So again, I mean, those are varietals. I haven't worked with Semillon or Semillon, as they say it, which is their wine. You know what I mean? Like in that area, that they have a very distinct way of making it. It was fascinating, but it was not something that that I used in skills here. But it's great to see how things are done and with other varietals. And so certainly Pinot Noir was not what I was working on in the Hunter Valley, and that was a cool change.
Sure. So tell me about the decision then to do your own thing. In addition to all the other things you're working on in Oregon Wine, when did you make the decision to start your own label?
After I worked at Northwest Wine, I made wine for other people, like a couple who owned a vineyard, and I consulted. Worked for places that, as a consultant who didn't have any enologist or someone on hand who was pretty new, and be able to help as much with the technical side of things as also input and experience at that point. And I enjoyed doing that, but there was some point when I started working. Louisa offered me a harvest, and I really wanted to just and I was consulting, but I just wanted to make the money over harvest, which was really helpful, and to have a different experience, just to have this, I go in again, and I mean, you never go home after harvest, but just to sleep. But while I was doing that, my dad, who never really understood kind of why I would choose a area like this, of kind of not being independent, which is what I was doing then. Nor did he understand in the music industry. He'd asked me about it again, and I told him all the things I loved about it, and he said, how much would it cost for you to make some wine this year? And I was like, I don't know. I've never thought about it. And I had never thought about it for myself. I thought people who did that were also crazy. What, it's so much money. I would never have that. How would you do all those things? Wear all the hats. And so, I figured it out, and I asked around about some fruit, and Sam suggested much in the way that Ivo had suggested bands to me, and Sam was like, I know a couple of vineyards who are looking. I think that you would do well with this one. Maybe call them and check them out. I did the budget. My dad's like, let's do it. So yeah, that was the beginning. And when I didn't really, I'd always had it in my mind that if I did something, that it would be so cool to name wines after songs or albums or bands, to bring music into it. So much wine, it looks like it's French, or it looks so serious, or it's from, people expect that you're part of a winemaking family, and generations, and that just wasn't my experience. I can't make that up. And my experience was, I listened to a lot of records. I worked with a lot of bands. I still love music, and it's a part of everything I do. So I had it in my head, but I hadn't really figured out how and what. So I ended up making some wine and bottling it and keeping it as shiners. And while I was scrambling for what am I gonna call it? What am I gonna, how is it? What's the focus? What's my wheel? It's too all over the place. Music, it's just too big. What's me? What says this is me about this wine? And I went and saw friends in bands that I used to work with and people in New York, and we'd sit and I'd pour the wine and we'd just talk about it. We'd just like throw out ideas and silly ideas and like bad ideas and cool ideas, but like didn't make sense, you know. But and it was so much fun, this process. And then a friend of mine, my friend Dave Rosenkrantz, who used to be the label manager at Sub Pop, who I've just been so close with for so long, he came up with the name The Pressing Plant. That the pressing plant is where like records are pressed, you know, and that wine is from a pressed plant. And I was like, oh my God, that's great. Let me sit with it, because I don't want it to be, I didn't want something to be like a joke. You know, I didn't want it to be like, oh, that's so clever. You know, like I just wanted to be like, yeah, you know, like music, records, pressing plants, you know. And so that stuck. And I'd always had it in my head that I wanted to do, I mean, the idea of it was probably more inspiring to me than the idea of making my own wine, you know, like because it could be fun, because this could bring something that seemed really daunting. The idea of the steep learning curve, not on the winemaking side at that point, but on the small lot winemaking side, very small lot at the beginning, but also on the on learning all this stuff that I never had to do to sell wine. You know what you got to do in order to make more wine. You know, but so this idea of it was just so fun and felt like me. It could keep me out of being afraid that I couldn't do it, because I was just could feel so me when we're talking about music. And so I had these ideas of like, oh, I I didn't really want to make rosé, but I want to make Pinot, but I had all these ideas for pink wines. This song, I was like, I want to call wine Pink Frost, after this really beautiful, like sparkly song by the Chills from New Zealand. And Pink Flag from Wire is like an amazing album, or the Pink Fairies, you know, this rock band from the 70s, and Pink Moon from Nick Drake, and Pink Turns to Blue from Husker Du, and I was just like, oh, pink! I don't want to make pink wine. Pink, you know, nothing wrong with rosé, but it's just kind of not where I wanted to start. But I was like, crap, you know, what can I do with red or white? And so it just became so fun and something to talk about. I went through, so basically I came up with this idea. I'm going to name it after like songs or albums, but most of the songs I chose were also album titles, so that kind of hedged kind of left me for a little while, like, okay, I could decide later. And it turns out, after talking to attorneys, it turns out that song titles and album titles are not copyrightable. So, a great example is Let It Be from the Beatles and Let It Be from the Replacements. You know, two albums that you can still call that, you know. So it was okay for me to use those names. By no means did I want to make money off of any of these people that were like idols and so inspiring, you know, but it was more of a tribute, you know, and also I wanted to share that excitement. Like when I worked in music, that was like, I was really good at my job as long as I was talking about music that I was really, you know, excited about. And the bands I worked with, like that's how I chose. Whenever I was given a project to work that I was not excited about, but that I needed to do, I just wasn't, like it was very hard for me to like sell it, you know? And so it's true, you know, for all of this. So that's kind of how that idea came that made me then be like, I should do this, you know? And so I worked with a lot of people were recommended. There's so many great designers in wine in the Willamette Valley, and I decided that I wanted to go outside of that, and I met a guy at a going away party, this guy Rob Jones, who runs a label here in town down the road, called Jealous Butcher Records, and he worked with some of my friends in bands, and he's just a great guy, and he's a graphic designer as well. And so we decided that we'd work together on coming up with a label, and I came up with a whole bunch of things that I just pulled off of the internet, different pictures that didn't have a whole lot in common, always, but usually a record. And then we looked at them and we played around with them, and he came up with something that worked, and we continued working. He came up with the logo, and it really suited the wine, and then what we could change each time. And I think that the way that a bottle looks is really important, and by no means should it. I remember there was like this wine a long time ago with like Marilyn Monroe on the cover with the dress and everything, and I thought, like, that's so, it looked cheesy. It looked like, oh, you're selling it on this, I didn't want to sell it on that. I wanted, though, like, people who also liked music, and like, why can't, I live in Portland, I lived in Portland for 20 years now. Like, I've lived here longer than I lived in New York, and it should be like art and music and like fun, and so, and that's like things that I love. So I wanted to be like that. So that's kind of how it came together, was actually the idea in the project that was specific. It was not all over the place. I would make the wine, I would think about the process, and think about a song that it felt like to me. I have to say that I'm a big fan of mixtapes in the past, and mixed CDs and also in the past, but of mixes and playlists. And I made different playlists for the wine for different times, different parts of the process. I wanted there to be really great music that gave me energy when I was working on it, that made me feel good. I remember when I was working at Archery Summit that there was someone there who during this harvest that played like really cheesy metal, and I remember Anna saying, like, I'm really sorry, I know we all get to take a turn, but this can't be good for the wine. And I was like, it can't. I know it's not good for us, And that went into the mix of like, yeah, then whenever I can, I'll play music while I'm doing it, play music to the wine. If I can't play music in my headphones, then play music during bottling, and think about it, And there was one part where, this is probably super long, I'm sorry.
No, oh no, please. Okay.
There was this one part, I haven't ever shared about this publicly, but it's this. So I was doing the 2012 Pinot Noir, and 2012 was a hot vintage, and I had and I worked with a vineyard who really needed a little longer time to get to ripeness. Like, it was really important, and their own wines from that vineyard, like, they were very high alcohol, and I worked with the vineyard and worked with the wine, and it was still hot, and not just like that was the primary part of it, but for me, this was my first Pinot that I had done under my own label, and I was just like, oh, I should have done this, much like when I cook, I'm like, oh, it could have been better if I'd done this, people are like, oh, I love this, I'm like, oh, could have used more salt, and there's something that is not self-effacing, it's just, I can see, I really want it to be perfect, it can't be perfect, and I was really annoyed with that 2012 for a while it was in barrel, and so people were asking me, like, what are you going to call it? And my main name for it was going to be, I love The Replacement so much, and it was going to be Unsatisfied, one of my favorite songs, and I remember my friend Adam Smith was like, you can't call it that. He's like, I love that song, but you can't call it that. That's really bad for business. I was like, I know. And I was going to name it after the Wipers, who are a Portland band, Over the Edge, because it was that way. And it softened. It came around. And by the time it was already, as I said, it was already bottled before I came up with the label and the name, before I decided on it. And I ended up, like, my love for that wine was that it was a punk rock wine. you know? And so I named it Smash It Up after The Damned. The Damned are like one of my favorite bands ever. My sister, like I have memories of my sister and I going to see them when we were really young, and I've met them over the years and just been a total, you know, fan. And I still go to see them. I still go to see them and I'm like, oh, The Damned, you know? And yeah, that's what it was, you know? And so when I poured that wine for people, I get to talk about the music. And so, you know, I get to talk about that feeling like a punk rock wine to me, that it's a little in your face. We did not use this term on the label, but you know, it's a little snotty. It's a little, you know, it's a little like, got some attitude, you know, and doesn't really care, and it is what it is, you know, and that's what it is. And it's not, you know, I love that wine, but it is not, it's not how I would have steered it at a different time if maybe now. But like, that's what wine is, right? Like, it's a moment, it's an experience, it's like a snapshot of where you are, you know, over this period of time of its life, and over a year. And that's the cool thing about it. It's kind of like plays, you know, you go and see a play and these people do the same play all the time, but like that night it's just for you, you know? And it's never going to be exactly the same. So one of the things with the music part also is that for me, I've never really enjoyed the really kind of pretentious, it's not always pretentious, the seriousness of wine discussions, you know? In terms of talking with other winemakers and talking shop, like that's just talking shop. Like that's you're sharing ideas or your opinions. But the idea that the wine can be classist is a bummer, you know? So when I started doing the pressing plant, two things that were important to me were that I make a wine that's affordable. I'd worked at, you know, I had helped, even after doing harvest, I often worked helping with tastings at Archery Summit, and those wines are very, very expensive. And I don't know anybody who buys those wines. I mean, I'm sure I do know people in the wine, you know, like, but that's not like, that's kind of not a regular thing for me. And so I really wanted to focus on making a $20 to $25 bottle of Pinot that was a great value, that was worth more than that in the spectrum of what it's priced. But, you know, a lot of people I talk to, $20 is more than they usually spend on a bottle of wine. And I wanted it to be accessible, but I also wanted people to not put it away for a couple of years. I really needed people to buy it and come back and buy another bottle, you know, like if they liked it. And so that seemed like a better like marketing strategy for me, being this one person company who needed to keep moving wine. And then also that other idea that if, besides telling people about the name, sometimes it doesn't even come up. Sometimes we're just talking about the wine. But if things got to a point where I didn't enjoy the conversation, or where I even felt uncomfortable, like selling myself, you know, it's awkward, you know, it's still a little awkward. And I could just talk about the music, and I instantly felt like I could hear that music. I could share why I loved it so much, you know, like, oh, you know, the video's on the website, you should check it out. Like, oh, you like so-and-so, oh, you know this band that covered that song, you should check out the MC5 version of Kick Out the Jams. Like, oh, you know, and you should see them when they play, you know. And yeah, so it kind of just worked into this way that felt a lot more like me than when I came here and looked at what wines from Oregon look like. It almost feels more like the craft beer industry. Like they get to have so much fun with their labels. It's not so, they can be a little irreverent. They can be just like of the moment. It's not a big deal if it's not the same from each time, you know. And I try to express that too in the, you know, I don't source grapes from the same places each vintage in order to make an affordable Pinot Noir. Affordable, you know, in order to hit my price point. but to make a nice wine for this $20, I have to kind of wait. My idea is that I've always been a thrifter, like being a punk rock kid, going to thrift shops, just being more excited by things like that, getting a good deal. And so I took that experience and I learned to just be patient. And I knew enough people who would hear about grapes that were for sale, often at the last minute, and that those people, by that time, either a buyer had fallen out, as is the case now in the Willamette Valley. There's often more fruit than was expected, and that they'd be willing to sell it to me for a price that I could still afford to buy them. And so I got some really great fruit for an affordable price for me. And so unfortunately I can't sign contracts because I don't definitely have this idea. From year to year it changes a bit, and so I found it's better for me to wait, and that then more interesting things come up each time. And sometimes it could be the same fruit, but it's not. It's more about trying to get the best thing I can in that moment that's available and working with it. It gives me a disadvantage I worked for the Ponzi's off and on for years, and I've made most of my wine there. Louisa was so generous in allowing me to make my wine alongside on my own time, but while I'm doing harvest there, and the advantage of getting to work with the same vineyards year after year at some place like Ponzi is you really get to know that fruit, and kind of where it makes a turn sometimes, or what might be more reductive, might have that possibility and things. But this is new fruit coming at you each time, oh, surprise, But the nice thing is when I worked at Northwest Wine Company, that's what we did. We had 30-something clients, and all this fruit came in, and you were just okay, go. And so learning to do that is an interesting challenge and a puzzle in itself. And so it's okay. Would I love to work with the same fruit all the time? Yes. But that's not part of my plan that makes this work in this way. So yeah, I don't even remember what exactly the question was.
I don't either, but that was a great answer either way, so I'm not worried about it. How would you describe, you kind of talked a little bit about this, but how would you describe your winemaking philosophy? What is it you're trying for people to get out of your wine?
Out of the pressing plant wine, I am aiming to make wine that is enjoyable now. I don't think at this price that people are going to put this away. And also one of the things we learned in a marketing class at Davis was that 90-something%, over 95% of people drink wine within 24 hours of buying it. So then it's kind of who am I making the wine for? So I want it to be ready now. I want it to be approachable. I want it to be delicious now, And so I tend to do a lower tannin extraction, less aggressive punch downs, really aware of when I'm doing them. As the alcohol increases, just kind of keeping an eye on that, really tasting a lot, seeing where I can keep the roundness in the wine. I want to make a fairly fruit-forward, oaked, but not with oak being, one of the things that stands out in that. Just in more traditional, aged in oak barrels, mostly neutral, and then I buy some new, a small amount of new oak with each vintage, just to have some things to play around with. I like bright acidity, but then I think that if I'm working on kind of the roundness and approachability of the wine, that the brightness for me helps me do a wine that I feel is true to my taste and interest, that's food friendly, but that is also something that people can enjoy. It's not shrill, or austere. Yeah.
You talked about the challenges of marketing and selling wine. Tell me about sort of some of your strategies for doing that. How have you gone about selling wine without having a tasting room, without having a formal place for people to buy wine? How do you go about getting your name out there and selling your wine?
I talked to a lot of other winemakers who are small and independent and asked them about how they did it, and also for distributors that they worked with that they thought might like my wine and things like that. So I spent a lot of time talking to people like John Groshaw and Anne Hubach, Pam from Willful, you know, and then I still have Sam and Cheryl and Louisa and people, but those are such bigger, you know, but to kind of understand how the system works and things like that. And years ago, I started a tasting group with Drew Voigt and Ben Castile and later Thomas Hausman and Steve Goff and Heather Perkin from Elk Cove and Darcy Pendergrass and who else? Eric from Now Jackson Wines, and, you know, and so many people that like they're resources. So I talked to a lot of people, but one of the things is that I think that my wine doesn't necessarily work in a fancy wine shop as well, you know, unless somebody really loves music and also kind of talks about that. So I went to New Seasons, which is where, like, down the road, I shop way too often at New Seasons, and I asked them how you submit something, and they told me you drop it off at the solutions counter and you fill out this little form, and I did that, and I heard back from them that they would love to take the wine, and I think I checked off a lot of the boxes. I'm super local, you know. I'm solo owned. I was new. I'm female owned, you know, a female winemaker, and I make a wine that $20 for an Oregon Pinot for a Willamette Valley Pinot is a good deal, you know, and they liked it. And so that really helped. That was like, okay, let's go, you know. And then I approached Whole Foods later when I had more wine, when I'd actually had enough to sell in Whole Foods, and the guy that buys the wine for the Northwest area was like, love it, love the idea, like, let's do it, you know. And so that was a different, and I find them very different places, you know. I'm so thrilled that New Seasons took it early on, and that I did a lot of tastings, poured for a lot of customers. When I pour at the store, I get to say like, oh yeah, this is my New Seasons too, you know, like, oh, where do you make this? You know, I make it out in the valley, and then I live just up the road, you know, and those are true things, you know. And then also Steve Jones at the Cheese Bar. I had worked at him when I had been hired to do a project of designing a winery for the Store Square Deal at the time. That didn't end up happening, but I worked on that for a while. And Steve said I could come in and pour it for him, and he's the first person that ever like bought the wine, you know. And then all of a sudden he's like, I really like it. And I was like, oh, this is so great. Like, you're just saying it, you know. I mean, it was so nice. It was a place where I really wanted to be, you know. And now when I think about things, I definitely get ideas when I hear that people involved are or were musicians, that they love music. One of my accounts, I sell the wine at Aviv, which is a vegan Israeli restaurant in Southeast. And I've been vegetarian since like my second year in college, and I was eating there, and I had just stopped to grab a bite, and I'm sitting at a table next to a turntable. I start looking through the records, and they're really cool records, and some of them I own, and some of them I'd like to own. And I asked the person serving, you know, if I could come back and pour my wine, and they said, you know, sure. And I poured it, and they were just like, yep, we are gonna pour it by the glass, and they've been doing that now for a few years. And so for me, that's a place like that I think about because I'm vegetarian, you know, and records, you know, and music. So we've got all of these things, and we did a winemaker restaurant dinner, chef dinner, out at a animal sanctuary at Wildwood Animal Farm Sanctuary. I think it's officially called something like that. And you know, I love animals. That's why I'm vegetarian, you know? And I grew up on a farm where we named the cows, and then there might be one in the freezer. It would be just so sad, you know, so sad. So there are things like that, or there's a really sweet store called Mom and Pop that's just up the road, and so like, it's my neighborhood, and they just opened, you know, a year or so ago. Maybe it's 2 years now. I can't. My sense of time is really terrible. But being here in a neighborhood area and with someone that I connect with on what they're interested about in wine and things like that is really fun. Yeah.
You described the way you described the music industry, at least as you got into it, and sort of the wine industry as you got into it, are very, very similar to me. It sounds like, finding a lot of people with one very big passion that you share, and then kind of going from there. So tell me about the kind of similarities you found in working in a wine industry like this, and getting into the music industry when you did. Are you feeling sort of similar feeling as you got into the industry?
There are a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
The first similarity that I noticed is that, like working with musicians, most musicians and many people that have independent labels, are kind of like one person, they're very mom and pop, don't have business backgrounds. I don't have a business background. I have experience in working in business, but like in businesses, but a lot of musicians don't have that. And coming out here, a lot of wineries are not really run in that way either. They're people that were interested in making wine and often did so on their own, or with their families, or with their partners. And then all of a sudden, they were big enough to, maybe before to be able to afford to hire another employee, but probably more it's like then they needed another employee, and they found the money somehow, and so there's some of that kind of at the beginning, in the early aughts, this is a long time ago. But there's kind of a lack of professionality at the time of where decisions and dealings were made kind of on instinct and sometimes were more personal. But I was really used to that. And I will say that those are kind of dysfunctional situations. I was very used to dysfunctional situations, and working with people who I just admired so much what they did, that artisanship, is that word, art, their craftsmanship, they're all of it, what they did was so special that it was worth dealing with, and so meeting a lot of people kind of that weren't necessarily people, like that. And musicians are the same way. So many musicians, like, they do what they do, like in this place inside, and then it comes out, and then they do it here, and then they might do it on stage, but then when they actually are interacting, it's not what they want to be doing, selling their own selves. That's not what they do well, and that's okay. Some do, but so there was that. The DIY independent kind of thing, the doing things for less money, being able to figure out ways to make ththings work, was very much the Willamette Valley, the Oregon wine industry to me, and that was really what I did. And even when I had bands on major labels, for me it was more interesting to try to find interesting, cool, like less expensive things to do than to do something flashy that didn't represent the band. Pixies, Frisbees. Why? Like okay, but like why? Like what about something that actually looks more like that, or like that they do, or that they Charles from the Pixies is really into UFOs. Like, why don't we do something with that? Like something that actually is connected, or something. I don't know. So there are those kind of things anyway, and here stringing it together and being able to make something really wonderful still by not having to have a lot of money to do it. It is a lot of money, but it's, I also personally really liked the social side of things. With bands, whether it was being on tour or working with other people who are writers and that you're pitching to, that you're sharing love for bands with. There's often, a lot of socializing and dinners and hanging out at shows and touring, and I toured with a lot of the bands that I worked with, and it was fun, and it was a different world, and it was it was fun. It was a little decadent, you know. And then when I came out here, that the wine industry is a lot like that too. You know, here's this thing we're all talking about wine, and we're having it at lunch, and we're having dinners, you know, that are based around the wines and opening all the wines, you know, and being loopy and having fun, and so there was that too of that they're both very kind of like loose industries in that way in terms of this area then, and and I think that all of that worked with kind of like what I had been doing and everything. So yeah.
You mentioned coming in and being conscious of being a woman in the industry and feeling like you had to be able to keep up and do things at the right speed. So tell me about your experience now being in the industry as long as you have, being a woman, especially now a one-woman shop in the Oregon wine industry.
I think that being a woman in the wine, being a female winemaker is like a fantastic place to be at this point. I think people, thank goodness, many people want to be very supportive of that, you know, and I think it's really cool. People are like, oh, that's so cool, you know, and it's like, oh, that's so nice to hear, you know, it's just, you know, I just am, you know, like, you know, can't change that. And, I mean, you can, but, you know, so it's, yeah, I find more support. I find sometimes that someone will look at the wine and say, I've only ever been asked this by older white men, who makes your wine? And I'm like, I make my wine. And they're like, where do you make it? Where's your winery? I go, you know, and I make most of it at Ponzi, where I work off and on, you know, and it's like, oh, Ponzi makes your wine. And I'm just like, wow, you know, wow. And it, you know, it's I take it a little personally, and here's my feelings, and it seems really wrong, but you know that is so not common. At least here, it's not common. One big account for me is a store in New York called Bottle Rocket, who are just amazing, and I love them so much, and they love music, and every year on International Women's Day, you know, either my wine or a picture of me makes it in their collage of other women that make alcohol that they sell, and you know, I love that, you know. I also get a shout out during record day, so I'm covered, you know. So I think it's actually a nice thing, you know, like it can be helpful. Sometimes for me, I think I think today in terms of sales, I don't feel that there's an issue, like with winemaking I don't think about it. But with sales, sometimes let me think of what the thing is with this. I'm really one of those people that's like, oh wow, I'm really glad you like it, thanks. Like genuinely happy to hear that somebody likes the wine. Not because I think that the wine is not likable or it's a big surprise to me, but it's really nice to hear that. You know, whether somebody's surprised based on the label or the price, or that they don't usually like Pinot. I hear that a lot, you know, because a lot of people have an idea that Pinot Noir is like thin, you know, and austere, and that's certainly, you know, there's a wide range of Pinots out there. That are still very characteristically Pinot Noir. So it's, I can be not as, yeah, I can do that. You know, and I find that sometimes that's a male, in male characteristic sometimes in this business, of just like saying right away, like, yep, I can do that, even though they've never done it before. Whereas I tend to be like, oh, I haven't ever done that before, but you know, I'm pretty sure that I could do that, and let me get back to you, you know. And so there's those kind of things that maybe can then maybe I don't take advantage of some things as much just based on things. But that's why the first person I ask about how to do things when I have questions about sales and marketing and things is John Groshop, because he's just like that. He's super down to earth, and he does that in a genuine way that is so true. So anyway, then I feel like I'm not just like, I'm just not like sales, and some people are great at that, and they do really well with that,
Those people are going to be very surprised when they find out who makes Ponzi's wines. If they're shocked that a woman can make wine, that's going to be a big surprise for them.
Yeah.
Tell me about the growth of your company and where you're kind of looking at as you look ahead for the next 10 years.
Right now, my current vintage is 1,300 cases, and I am now focused mostly on Pinot Noir, all from the Willamette Valley. And I've had an idea for a little while that I would like to work either with some Southern Oregon or some fruit from the gorge, because I think it would be fun, and because it's just a different varietal. Although I always like Pinot, I feel like I feel super comfortable with Pinot Noir, and super excited by it still, and all of that. But because of the fires, it hasn't, since I've been thinking about that, there hasn't been a good year to be buying fruit that isn't smoky, and that may be our future. So I don't know what will happen with that. I think it would be fun to do some different varietals, but again, right now, what I find when I'm self-distributed in Oregon, so I deliver all my wine, I do all my tastings, so it's just me. And so when I pour for people, I have found that when I have 2 wines or even 3 wines, for a little while I was doing like 2 vintages of Pinot, as one was on its way out and one was on its way in, and a Riesling or a Chardonnay. The more wines I pour, the less wine I sell, because people can't decide. Like, they might like all of them, but then they can't decide. And when I pour one wine, people are like yes or no, and a lot of times it's yes. I sell a lot of wine when I pour wine, and it's great, And so right now, I need for my business to continue to grow, and hopefully to grow to where I can afford the person that I need to have, and to continue growing in production, and to be growing in distribution. And I mean, my ideal thing, I've always wanted to have a partner in this. I would love to find a partner, not necessarily that one person takes over this area and one person takes over that area, but the idea of bouncing ideas off one another, and the things that you come up with, which are neither what one person had an idea of or the other person, but the creative aspect of it is just amazing, Plus, some people are better at some things than others, I like making wine on my own. It's not a compromise, and you gotta pick a side, I can just do it and do the best that I can, and that's good enough, and someone else could do that too, but I don't think I would want to debate that, so, but there's room for that. But that's how I would like to see this grow, is to have room for others who I can get super overwhelmed, and when that happens, it's harder. What that does is that I double down on sales and deliveries and the things that I know I need to do right now in front of me, and I get away from the creative part that's really necessary to grow and necessary for me to wake up every day and say oh yay, I get to do this. So that's where I hope that I go with this. Yeah.
So you're right around 20 years in the industry now.
Yeah, scary.
Tell me about what you've seen change in the Oregon wine industry since you got into it.
Certainly there are a lot more wineries, but I'm one of them, It's kind of that thing about when people talk about Portland growing, Portland's just gotten this way, and it's yeah, but there are more bands, and there's better art, and there are more opportunities for my friends who are artists and musicians, and for people like me to do my own thing. And So I think that what has stayed the same is that a lot of the players and the pioneers are still, a lot of them are still here, especially a lot of the pioneers. What's changing are, what I first saw change was the acquisition of vineyards and to be managed by, a larger viticulture vineyard management companies and more machine harvested fruit, which, I mean, if you're making grocery store wine, not New Seasons and Whole Foods, but you're making you're making canned wine, like there's nothing wrong with that. I think the packaging is really cool, but you can't afford to make wine in the same more traditional way with barrel ferments, so the way that grapes are being grown is different. Who owns those vineyards is different, is changing. Whether things are fermented in the same way or now some wineries have giant tanks that rival, some of the giant wineries in Napa. And so those things have changed. California wineries, of course, coming up here. French wineries coming here. It's changing things. There's some better and some worse for all of that. I think that one of the things I've seen change is I have seen more people who have gone to school or who have had experience in the industry go to school, to learn more about the wine that they're making and to have a really complete view of their winemaking process and of grape growing. And I've seen that change with vineyard owners as well, who, when I started, I remember being warned, so you got to be careful because a vineyard owner will be like, you ready to pick the fruit? You ready to pick the fruit? Because I'm supposed to be in whatever country that's warm right this week, And so that was their idea of a picking decision. And of course, that's not, Pinot Noir is a tricky grape, and we have lived in a tricky climate that was based on when the rains started, and not in the past few years as much, but so that's changed. That idea that vineyard owners are working more closely with winemakers and wineries, and that they're often hiring people who are experts in doing it to kind of turn over some of it, using less pesticides, more importance on an awareness of live and biodynamic and organic, the idea of less sulfur rather than it being an organic wine, just trying to be more less intervention, doing what you need to. In a year with a lot of botrytis, you might need to add sulfur. That's the best thing for the wine, and when you don't, native ferments, doing things because you should. And then there are a lot of people in the industry who are doing really interesting things like natural wines, and I'm so interested in what they're doing. I'm not interested in making them for my label. That doesn't fit what I'm doing, but I love that people are doing it, and that it opens the field of what Willamette Valley what can be produced here in Oregon in general.
Sure. And what do you see as you look ahead in the Oregon wine industry for the next decade? What do you see happening to the industry?
Oh, that's such a tough one. I think that there's so many changes right now that it's kind of a really good time to be present right now and be paying attention and to be participating in the sales of wineries and vineyards. But also, I think the climate change, obviously, is going to, I'm sure everybody talks about climate change and global warming, it's changing things, and we're not picking for the same reasons. We're not picking at the same time. We're not picking in the same month. And we're not producing the same style of Pinot Noir that cooler climate produced. and probably some other varietals that I haven't been working with and haven't had experience are probably able to be grown here now. So I think that there will be changes in what, as people move up from California, varietals will move up from Southern Oregon and other places, and I think that it will be different. I think we'll have a lot of big companies, big wineries, and then we will always have these people that are trying really innovative things and doing things that are outside of those big companies. And maybe Oregonians will start moving to, BC or something, to Okanagan, and I don't know. If just for not having to have air conditioning in your house, When I moved here, you didn't have an air conditioner. I don't need an air conditioner. It's a foolish decision not to have one these days. It's all changed.
It used to be 5 hot days of summer. You were fine.
I know, this summer, yeah. Well, we're not to August yet, August, September.
So what advice would you have for someone who wanted to enter the Oregon wine industry today?
I think that doing a harvest is a great thing to do. I still think it's a great reality check, and I still think it's the reality of what people do. I have to do all of that stuff still. In those days of Willa Kenzie, I called my mom during that harvest, and I was my mom's like, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm so tired. It's so hard, And my mom said, "One day you're going to have other people to do that cleaning and to do that." And I was like, "Okay, and I have had other people at different jobs. But now I don't have other people, and then I'm like, oh, I get to clean the tanks. My tanks are so much smaller, and they don't have to put ladders in them, these little 10.5 fermenters and things, and, So I think I have always felt, from when I got my first job in the industry, in the music industry, I had done an internship, to my jobs within wine have been with internships, and I think that getting experience, being curious, coming there without any sort of attitude of what you know, but asking a lot of questions. I think that's really hard because we all come in with we know all this stuff about wine, and we want to make sure that other people know that we're part of it somehow. But I think that I wish that I asked a lot of questions early on, but at the same time, I wish that I had not thought that I was supposed to know things. That how would I have ever had a chance to know those things, So it's kind of a weird idea. I think I would have relaxed into the job a little bit better and maybe learned some more things. And it's okay to mess up. Not mess up in a big way. Other people do it, but where you dent tanks or hit a valve with the forklift. I've seen that happen, and that's traumatic for people and and difficult, But yeah, being slow, being careful, and working at a winery. Yeah.
What was the biggest surprise for you about the job of a winemaker?
I think from before I did it, I think the biggest surprise was how physical the job was. I really thought that this was going to be much more science, and it is science. But I didn't think I'd be working in a lab. But I definitely know people I went to school with who have to write work orders because it's a union situation, But it's so hands-on and it's so physical, and I love that. And I didn't know that I would love that, I love that. And so that was that part of it. In terms of being a winemaker with my own brand, the most eye-opening thing is how people do this if they don't have a lot of money. Because the idea of making wine in this vintage that will be bottled next year, and then released probably the following year, and then basing this next year in the middle, how much you're going to make based on these sales that haven't even started yet, you know, that has been, I've been a little up and down with that, and still learning, you know, still finding where that spot is. It's not, for me, it has not been a linear way, and sometimes I haven't had money to do a harvest, and I skipped a harvest, you know, but I have plenty of wine to sell, so there's no problem. You know, so, and it's okay. It's okay. So those are, yeah, you know that thing, you know, how do you make a small fortune in the wine industry? You start with a big fortune. Like, a lot of us didn't start with a big fortune. You know, we started with a loan from people that wanted us to help us succeed, and end up with other loans, and then making decisions based on those things instead of what you'd like to be doing, but you do it, and that's business, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's all the questions that I have for you today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have, anything we didn't cover that we should have talked about? You have open mic, so. Yeah.
Let me think. I will say that the only thing that I didn't talk about, that I almost mentioned during that, is that pretty much, well, like 2 years after I started the pressing plant, that I've been a sober winemaker, and that is an unusual thing to be in this business. But yeah, I got sober in the end of 2013 after I already had some wine made and some wine in barrel, and wasn't sure really what would happen from there in terms of wine for me. But having had a more traditional training at UC Davis and learned to taste and spit, and you don't drink while you work and things like that, it's been a really amazing way to still participate in this. And you know, I still make wine exactly how I made wine before. I just don't spend time drinking it and feeling the effects of it. And I don't socialize as much with people in the industry, which is sad, you know, but it just kind of makes sense, because there's that frenzy of excitement, you know, as I was talking about before. And but sometimes people think, like, how could you do that? And I guess I wanted to share that because this is a job that one gets experience and training in, and that's not necessary. And yet this is also an industry where a lot of people drink a lot, and that there's still space for us to do it. I would say my business has gone incredibly well after that decision, and when I get up, I'm not just happy about that I get to make this wine, you know, and things for me felt easier. And sometimes I feel like that's a funny, it's not a marketing point, you know, you'll love my wine, but I don't drink it, you know, like, you should drink it, but I'm not going to. But it's more of like, to do something well, and to be able to stand behind it and be proud of it, and to no longer engage in a part of the industry that slowed my life down and kept me from being able to be present. And so, yeah, I get there, few of us now, and it's kind of exciting when I read about it in other places, or I run into other people, or other people share that with me, and yeah, I think that's a part of my life, and very much a part of my being a winemaker today. So yeah.
Well, congratulations. That's incredibly positive. I'm impressed. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today, for your sitting down with us and giving us all these wonderful stories and answers.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.